I am Lang Smith, founder of Heroes for Life, and I welcome you to this series, PTSD and the First Responder. This is part 1 of the series, and it encompasses the basics behind PTSD. I passionately believe that first responders are continually exposed to trauma that can, over time, cause not only post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, but may in fact cause complex PTSD. I believe that the incidence of PTSD in first responders is significantly higher than experienced by the general population, and only getting worse. I believe that a combination of bilateral stimulation, like EMDR, and somatic experiencing, or SE, may be more effective than either therapy by itself. In fact, what you've been listening to so far is an example of bilateral stimulation. Bilateral music is music that is designed to stimulate both the right and left hemispheres, or sides of the brain. Bilateral stimulation is just one of the therapy modalities I utilize when treating PTSD. So many of us wonder why some first responders are affected and others are not. I am Lang Smith, founder of Heroes for Life. I worked in the field for 26 years as a paramedic, and on June 12, 2012, I was forced to retire due to PTSD. Since that time, it has been my mission to play an active role in my healing by researching, experiencing, and learning effective PTSD therapy modalities. This video series is a culmination of empirical research and the experiences that brought about post-traumatic growth in PTSD survivors. I believe the primary root cause for PTSD in first responders stems from disenfranchised grief and self-disenfranchisement. I believe the secondary root cause is polyvictimization. Disenfranchised grief is an emotion which people experience when they incur a personal loss that is not openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. Self-disenfranchisement is the silencing of the self because of social expectations or perceived social expectations. Like, first responders can take it, right? Or, in order to be a great first responder, I can't show my feelings, right? Self-disenfranchisement in these situations becomes a bondage to grief that is not allowed and cannot be mourned. The theories of disenfranchised grief and self-disenfranchisement are best modeled in R.J. Walker's poem, Deceit and I.
Deceit and I have a strictly professional relationship with benefits. We've been seeing each other for years. Since before I told my aunt her birthday gift was still in the mail. Since before I told my bishop that I never touched myself. But Deceit and I started really getting serious back in my ambulance days when we worked together. We hit the sirens and drove to the trailer park that we called Wyoming because nothing good ever happened there. We got the call at 3 a.m. Unresponsive infant. The parents stood over us, large and stiff and weeping like mountains in spring, shrinking as the snow and ice melted from their eyes. Beneath us all, a child so cold and blue he could have been winter. Deceit and I did CPR for a lifetime. CPR always lasts a lifetime. But we knew from the beginning, this blue baby boy had been dead for who knows how long. There was no crib in this one-bedroom trailer. These people with mountains for bodies kept the baby in their own bed and smothered him in their sleep. What a horror it is to kill the one you hold close by holding them close. Deceit handed me the clipboard, and my tongue grew thorns as I wrote SIDS as the chief complaint. And I told a lie the size of God's hands. as long and as dark as the midnight between stars. It's not your fault, I lied. Sometimes they just stop breathing in the night. It's called sudden infant death syndrome, and we don't know what causes it. And Mother Mountain fell to her knees and shrieked so loud I thought the earth would retreat beneath us. A lie this big could move mountains, but the truth could obliterate them. The truth was a leather belt tied around a ceiling fan with mouth wide open, hungry for her neck. The truth was all the whiskey in the world, thirsty for his blood, and a new dead drunk to call home. I can live with the guilt of a lie, but I could not live with the guilt of their guilt. So I lied. Like Cain was in the corner taking notes. You made the right decision, lied the medical director. Good job, lied the nurses on my way out. When I woke up, Deceit asked, "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I lied. "You didn't have nightmares?" "No," I lied. I slept like a baby.
Choosing to allow or disallow this grief are the psychological functions of shame. Shame is a psychological regulator that prevents the experience of grief from occurring. When shame takes place, the self turns inward, and disenfranchised grief can create an injury to one's relationship with oneself. Prior disenfranchisement, especially from childhood, can function as a rule as to how grief is done. They say there's no crying in baseball, but maybe there should be in emergency services. I believe that the second root cause for PTSD in first responders is polyvictimization. Polyvictimization is the exposure to multiple types of interpersonal traumatic stressors. Take a minute and think back over your career. How many times have you been exposed to interpersonal traumatic stressors? We often refer to these events as bad calls. All first responders can be touched by PTSD, but not all are equally affected. According to the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance, nearly 600 EMS and firefighter suicides have been documented from 2012 to early 2015. Additionally, the Carson J. Spencer Foundation found that in 2012 alone, there were 126 documented suicides of police officers versus 49 killed by gunfire in the line of duty. If one adds up the findings of these two studies together, then we are losing one first responder nearly every day to suicide in the United States. If first responder suicides are simply the tip of the proverbial iceberg, then how vast and widespread are first responder mental health issues like PTSD, anxiety, or depression? It is estimated that up to 35% of police officers may meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at any given point. An Australian study of firefighters by Climb and Westphal found that 7% of firefighters had severe levels of PTSD symptoms. Additionally, 68% indicated moderate level PTSD symptoms, and 53% of those with PTSD at 4 months had PTSD at 29 months. McFarland, Williamson, and Barton discovered that paramedics were found to have higher levels of peritraumatic dissociation and more symptoms than either police or firefighters. It may be more difficult for paramedic personnel to maintain a detached attitude towards their work, as they often have longer and more intimate contact with injured survivors during recovery operations. Research has shown that there are things that increase responder risk for PTSD, In fact, sustaining an injury was the strongest risk factor for PTSD in first responders involved in the World Trade Center disaster rescue. Females with higher than average levels of the stress-managing hormone pituitary adenylate cyclase activating polypeptide, otherwise known as PA-CAP, had 5 times more PTSD symptoms than females with lower than average levels. By contrast, PA-CAP levels were unrelated to PTSD symptoms in males. Since the PA-CAP system is shaped, in part, by the female hormone estrogen, these differences could help to explain why women are twice as likely as men to develop the disorder. But what is PTSD? I'm going to look at 2 approaches to understanding trauma. The first is somatic experiencing and its methodology. And the second is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, and its methodology. SE holds true that trauma is not caused by the event itself, but rather develops through the failure of the body, psyche, and nervous system to process adverse events. EMDR, on the other hand, states that the event was so disturbing that it disrupted the information processing system of the brain, and the memory therefore became encoded with emotions, physical sensations, and beliefs experienced at that time. The American Psychological Association utilizes the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM, for the purpose of diagnosing all known mental disorders. Currently, the APA is on the 5th version of the DSM. The DSM-5 contains 4 distinct diagnostic clusters: re-experiencing, avoidance, negative cognitions and mood, and arousal. The first diagnostic cluster is re-experiencing, and re-experiencing refers to having spontaneous or intrusive memories of the traumatic event, recurrent dreams related to it, and flashbacks or other intense or prolonged psychological distress related to the event. The diagnostic cluster of avoidance refers to avoiding distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, or external reminders of the event. The next diagnostic cluster is negative cognitions and mood. It represents a myriad of feelings from a persistent and distorted sense of blame of self or others, to estrangement from others, or markedly diminished interest in activities, to an inability to remember key aspects of the event. The final diagnostic cluster is arousal, and again arousal is marked by aggressive, reckless, or self-destructive behavior, sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, or related problems. The DSM-5 categorizes 2 subtypes of PTSD. There's PTSD in children younger than age of 6, and PTSD with prominent dissociative symptoms, either experiences of feeling detached from one's own mind or body, or experiences in which the world seems unreal, dreamlike, or distorted. The current DSM-5 PTSD diagnosis does not fully capture the severe psychological harm that occurs with prolonged, repeated trauma as experienced by first responders. A new classification of complex PTSD is sorely needed. Complex PTSD is a result from chronic or long-term exposure to emotional trauma over which a victim has little or no control and from which there is little or no hope of escape. Those who suffer from CPTSD may be experiencing feelings from all their traumatic exposure, even as they try to address the most recent traumatic event. Complex PTSD sufferers may stuff or suppress their emotional reactions to traumatic events. They do this either because they believe each event by itself doesn't seem like such a big deal, or because they see no satisfactory resolution opportunity available to them. This suppression of emotional baggage can continue for a long time, either until a last straw event occurs, or a safer emotional environment emerges and the dam begins to break. What are the symptoms of PTSD? Well, persistent re-experiencing of the traumatic events. Some would call these flashbacks or intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that consistently enter your mind against your will. They're considered intrusive because you simply cannot get them out of your mind, and they often pop up at unusual moments. Intrusive thoughts may also occur in flashes and often cause significant anxiety when they enter your mind. The next symptom is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. Do you avoid intersections where you ran a particularly bad wreck? Maybe you avoid neighborhoods where you had a particularly bad structure fire. What things do you avoid? Is it getting to the point that you want to crawl inside your shell and avoid everything? The next symptom is numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma. Throughout your career, you have built up different coping mechanisms to try to create balance in your life. As time goes by, you may have failed to notice that your coping mechanisms have become unhealthy. In fact, it's not uncommon to find many first responders, quote, addicted, close quote, to alcohol, drugs, or pornography. All are just examples of coping mechanisms gone wrong. Scott Nichols said it best: when good things become ultimate things, then ultimately those good things become destructive things. Next is persistent and distorted blame of self or others, and a persistent negative emotional state. Have you noticed an increase in your hostility? Are you quicker to fly off the handle? Are you constantly placing blame on yourself or others? The next symptom is persistent alterations in arousal and reactivity. It's exhibited by reckless or destructive behavior. Do you find yourself doing things you would have never entertained before? Maybe it takes extremes to get excited or get off about life. Finally, we have persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma. This is called hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is an enhanced state of sensory sensitivity accompanied by an exaggerated intensity of behaviors whose purpose is to detect threats. If you suffer from hypervigilance, you may be engaging in an exhausting, never-ending strategy of scanning your environment for evidence of danger. Additionally, there may be acute changes in your sense of taste or hearing, as well as an exaggerated startle response. The defining characteristic of complex PTSD is the amount of therapy and time needed to resolve the trauma. Due to the high level of disorganization of the physiology, clients with complex PTSD are more likely to be measuring recovery time in many months or years, rather than just a few sessions. I believe that disenfranchised grief, self-disenfranchisement, shame, and polyvictimization are the root causes for PTSD in first responders. I believe that this issue is at epidemic proportions, and almost every day we lose another first responder to suicide in the United States. Complex PTSD results from chronic or long-term exposure to emotional trauma over which the victim has little or no control. Sufferers may stuff or suppress their emotional reaction to traumatic events. Trauma resolution, or recovery time, may be measured in many months or years, but there are effective new treatment modalities that can shorten recovery time and provide substantial post-traumatic growth. I strongly recommend you watch the next video in this series, Therapy Strategies. I thank you for watching this presentation. and I leave you with the sounds of bilateral music stimulation. I hope you found this information helpful and will welcome your feedback and comments. Please visit my website for additional presentations.